Hey woodworkers. Alright, welcome back. We're talking about veneering and more importantly flattening veneer. So first of all, veneer has gotten a really bad rap several years ago, maybe 20 years ago or more, because what they would use is a really pretty veneer and they'd put this onto an inferior product, something like a chipboard or something that doesn't have any long grain strength. So put this thing on there, corners would get damaged, sagging would happen if these were shelves. It just doesn't do very well in those types of environments. Having said that, it really got away from where veneering started off with. The genesis of veneering was to maximize a material here for its aesthetic properties and really get the most out of this tree or this amount of resources. So that's what we're going to talk about today. In preparation of using veneering, we need to make sure that this material is flat and ready to be adhered down to a substrate. For the design that we're going to talk about here, we are going to be using the veneer in such a way that we couldn't ever get away with using solid wood. Solid wood, because of the movement and the various points of weakness, potentially, or short grain issues, it just wouldn't work for a solid wood design. But for veneer, it's perfect, assuming it goes onto an inert substrate. So something that this would be adhered to. Don't have to worry about expansion, contraction. Don't have to worry about cupping and all that stuff. It's going to be an ideal situation. Okay, so this is the after. This is something that's already been flattened, but I rejected this, and I'll talk about why in a second. These pieces have been cut down from a little bit more than 8 feet. For what I need, that's perfect. And I could flatten longer pieces, I could flatten wider pieces, but for my purposes, this is about where I need to be. You'll notice that it has a bit of this curvature, and that has to do with how you receive this from wherever your veneer supplier is. Oftentimes, veneer suppliers are not a local situation. You can just run down and pick some up. So this has to be shipped, and this is typically how it gets shipped. So into a box, they tape this around so that it has integrity here, and it's also not an 8-foot long flat box which is going to get compromised, and if this gets bent or folded or creased, then your veneer is also compromised. So, alright, so this shape worries me much less than what I'm seeing on these little ripples, or the figure of the wood. Those have got to be dead flat before you can adhere it down to a substrate successfully. It's really easy if you do have some of this rippling or irregularity. You could adhere it down, but if there's a high spot and there's nothing bonding this to your substrate, then this is not going to work. It's going to fail. Anytime you set something on that, it's always going to be kind of raised up or teed up, waiting for some damage or injury to happen. So that's a problem. You can fill those things in after the rest of the veneer is being adhered, but it's always going to be raised up, and it just doesn't work. And I should also say, this is a relatively subtle example of veneer buckles or issues with veneer. This is for the most part pretty good, but it's still too uneven to really adhere down to a substrate. This is a substrate that I want to talk about now, and now let me see if I can zoom in on this. It's tough when you're your own camera person. Okay. So there are some areas that, after I flattened this in the process we're going to talk about, I still felt some areas that didn't totally flatten out, which is typical. You can re-flatten these areas, but for the most part, I had everything else that I needed. These were the only areas of concern. I'm not sure if you can make out what I'm seeing, but there is, in those circled areas, this is as good as I can do. In those circled areas, there's a little high spot here that, as everything else was flattening, this part held on to that shape that all of this grain, if you envision, this is no longer a straight grain because of the character or the chatoyance that's going to develop into this board, or pardon me, into this veneer. There are certain areas that really maintain that internal stress of the veneer. So between these 2 points that have a lot of ripples here in the long grain orientation, this is unacceptable. I could use from here down and that's okay, but that's awfully short for my purposes. But everywhere else feels nice and flat. I can walk this through and feel that I'm not going to have any issues. If this runs something flatter without this other material, you kind of have a better sense of what I'm describing. So let's say I have this plywood here. You can see that this is going to start to lay out pretty flat. You can really feel if there's any issues. Start to do that to these areas. I can't quite press those down, and if I do, it starts to push out everywhere else that's already been flattened. So it really becomes this dance of making sure that everything is totally flat and acceptable before you move on to the next step. Alright, so getting rid of this one. So for the flattening process, I need to zoom out. There we go. So when veneer is cut, it's this really incredible process, but it's very violent with respect to the board. It's the shearing process of having this long blade that cuts these things, sometimes in big sheets or rolls, sometimes in just a sequential match of the log. And both of them work for your purposes, but in that they have to prepare this by soaking it into hot water for a series of days. And we're talking about boiling hot water, and it softens all the cells of the board. That makes the cutting easier, but it doesn't do any favors for when this stuff dries. And if you think about the thickness of this veneer, it starts to evaporate that extra material that was forced or imposed into this somewhat rapidly. And so it has a tendency, when it evaporates that material, to start going back to all of the different long grain that exists in this environment and starts doing weird things. So now we need to flatten it. I've heard examples of people using various products. Let me check my camera for a second. Various products, and sometimes no products at all. I've heard that some people have used, there you go, have used just an iron, and the iron is only beneficial when you don't consider the heat, but when you think about the steam that's created. So if you're introducing steam into this environment, you can flatten these things out. I don't love it as much as I like commercially available products or recipes you can make on your own, because with the presence of just steam, you don't introduce any materials or products to keep this flat. You also are forcing steam into the cells of the wood, but that's limited as well, because steam is good, but if you can lubricate the cell walls first and then introduce steam, that's much better. So a product like this is Super Soft 2, which suggests there was a first version of this which was not as good. Yeah, there you go. I love this product. It's easy. I've made my own recipes. It works well also. But there's different variations of this. In essence, water, glycerin, and some type of a PVA glue, usually white glue, sometimes yellow. And then I've also heard people introducing rubbing alcohol as well into this environment. And each one of them have a specific purpose. The water obviously dilutes everything that's in here except for the alcohol. But with the glue in place, the glue gets in and goes into the pores. Heavily diluted glue will hold into the cell structure of all of the material, and it helps to keep whatever shape you're imposing to it. So if I'm flattening it, it'll help to hold that shape better. Glycerin, it basically functions as a lubricant, so it'll make everything slick and easy for the water and the adhesive to get in there and do its job. The alcohol just helps with the drying process, and it helps to evacuate this moisture faster. There's basically a million different variations and proportions of these, but those are the 3, possibly 4 main ingredients to softening veneer. This is ready made, and it's an easy thing to get. I've introduced this into a spray bottle, and that makes life so much easier. All right, so it's before we do any softening, as the name suggests, this is kind of rigid, and it's kind of easy to conform, but at the same time it's not, you can tell that there's no presence of those chemicals to get in and really make this malleable, like that first piece I was showing you. So with this, I'm going to douse this, both faces, with this product, and then it's going to get one step closer to putting into an environment where I can do the flattening. Flattening is only possible if I have something between both faces of this veneer to receive or absorb that excess moisture that we're introducing to it. And so that brings us to what's going on over here. So talking about what I have here, I've got flattened, so just something flat that I trust that I can hold the weight of this whole thing and transport it around. I can go with thicker plywood or MDF or whatever, but this makes my life a little bit easier. I also, with this thickness, don't have to worry about corners in the same way. This is a 1/4 inch thick, if you can't see. The other things that I have are a couple of layers of newsprint. So I've just gotten newspaper from, well, wherever you get a newspaper from, but they give free newspapers at grocery stores, so I grab those by the dozens when I'm walking out, and they always give me a strange look, but it works. The other thing that I have, and this is, I would argue, much more important than just the presence of the absorption, is just screen material, and this is composite screen. It's a plastic material. I do not use the aluminum or the steel, if you could find that anymore, screen material, because that sometimes has a reaction with the chemicals into this recipe, and that could start to stain your veneer, which is not ideal. So a couple layers of this, that'll absorb the moisture. The thing to keep in mind is that I can't go overboard with the number of layers of this stuff. If I were to go 10 or 15 or even 30 layers of this stuff, it starts to develop its own problems of not staying flat once it absorbs that moisture. So a couple layers here, I lay down screen on top of that, veneer goes in between, and then I'll reverse that process. So veneer, then more screen, then newsprint, and then I'll continue to stack these things up. The reason that this screen works, and arguably is more important than what it is you're using for absorbing the moisture, is that this separates the veneer from what is now going to be wet. If this was in constant contact with the veneer, then you're not really drying the veneer or allowing the process to work where it's pulling out the moisture that's trapped into the veneer. This functions as a release, so that moisture will go through the veneer and then out into the newsprint, and then that allows this to actually dry. If you don't have this layer, then it starts to become a challenge. Okay, so let me continue to work through this, and I'll describe my steps as we go. All right, so I already laid down a bunch of these layers. Be kind of gentle with this, although I'm not terribly concerned about the ends. You can see these ends are already shot. So the question is always posed about how much of this stuff to use, which is valid. I am pretty generous with this, as you can see. And I just want to have a nice even layer everywhere. If I have lots of pooling of this stuff, then I think it's a little bit too much, but with the process of drying, this stuff goes away. I do want to get both faces, because you see it doesn't absorb all the way through, and I really do want to get this to penetrate into every bit of the veneer. Okay, so once that's there, So once that's there, another layer of the screen. And then we just do more of the newsprint as we described. I'm probably going 3 or 4 layers of this newsprint per row. Alright, our screen. And continue to work up the layers. I was hoping to illustrate in doing this, as you'll see, that the number of layers that you add to this starts to diminish that flatness that we were talking about earlier. And that's kind of the name of the game. As much as I can get it flat, then I have less of these problems that I talked about before. If I have these little bubbles here or ripples, that's usually because I've got something that's not flat to start with, and it's unable to release that moisture evenly or consistently. I think that applying this starts to, you need to start off a little bit heavier handed at the beginning. Once you've got these things well on their way, then you have to do this a little bit less liberally. Alright, so I'm going to continue layering these things up. The other thing we should talk about is once I get this stack where I want it to be, how long is this going to take? And that's kind of a big question, because there is no one answer to any of this. It kind of depends on how problematic your veneer was to begin with. If I have a really horrible piece that needs a lot of attention, I have to just go slow and steady. I can't force this. I can't outsmart this wood and think that if I put more material on here or more pressure or more whatever, it's going to expedite any of the things that I'm looking to do. So kind of just have to watch this and hope that I end up getting the right results. And you're going to be difficult. I'll save you. I've cut this screen so that it fits the size of the veneer that I'm using. This is one of those annoying additional costs that the workers run into constantly and just can't seem to find their way out of. My clients will never see this screen, but I know that if I don't do it, I'm asking for trouble. So I should say the other thing that you can use, sorry camera, the other thing you can use if newsprint is not desirable to you, or I shouldn't say available, but if that's something that you can't find, paper bags, grocery paper bags work great as well. And so they're thick, they're cheap, and they absorb just as well as newsprint does or well. Alright, I think I did okay. Alright, so now I have my layers. I'm going to put these other pieces of veneer in the next batch. I should say that when you're getting ready to flatten veneer, you have to be aware of the fact that this veneer is not going to stay flat. So if you were in the process of purchasing a bunch of veneer and you just thought, well, I'm just going to knock all this out and start flattening, and then I'll just be ready to use it when I need to, you're going to start to realize the hard way that that's not the case. Once this veneer is flattened, it's great for a very short period of time. It's when you